I told you not to bring her into my house!
Dad, she's my wife.
A nurse from Petworth who counsel you place on her. Here it is, the final clause. This can't be real. Oh, it's very real. I disown you, my son. You can't do this!
Stop, please!
I told you not to bring her into my house. Walter Calloway's voice cracked across the ballroom like a dropped glass. 300 guests went still. The string quartet's bow hovered mid-stroke and did not come down, Dad. Marcus's jaw was tight. She's my wife, your wife. Walter said the word like it tasted bad in his mouth. A nurse from Petworth who cleans up after other people's children. You threw away everything I built so you could play house with her. Simone Calloway stood very still in her Navy's dress with her chin level and her hands folded in front of her, the way she stood over a crash cart when a room full of people were losing their nerve, and somebody needed to not be one of them. Mr. Calloway, she said, do not speak in my home. Her hands did not shake. That was the thing she was proudest of later, when she let herself think about it at all. Her hands did not shake. What none of the 300 people in that room knew, what Walter Calloway himself did not know, standing there with his face going red under the chandeliers, was that a black Suburban with government plates had just cleared the security gate at the end of his own driveway, and the man in the back seat had spent the last 6 minutes deciding whether to walk into this house as a guest or as something else entirely. Simone Calloway had no idea that car existed either. She only knew she was standing in a room full of people who had decided, before she ever opened her mouth, exactly what she was worth, and she was doing the thing her mother had taught her to do in rooms like that, which was nothing, which was everything, which was simply refusing to look away first. This is the story of the 11 days that followed. It is also the story of a hospital in Southeast Washington that never should have believed a lie, a defense contract worth more than most cities, and one father who had spent 30 years learning exactly how loud silence could be. Stick with me. 6 hours earlier, Simone had been sitting in a supply closet at Unity Children's Hospital eating a granola bar because the cafeteria closed at 3 and her shift didn't end until 4. She'd been a pediatric nurse for 8 years, 5 of them at Unity. And there was a particular kind of tired that came from a double shift that had nothing to do with sleep. It lived in the joints. It lived behind the eyes. She had spent the last 2 hours of it holding an 11-month-old named Darius while his oxygen levels climbed back into the range where his mother's face stopped, looking like she was underwater. That was the job. Nobody clapped for it. Nobody was supposed to. Her phone buzzed against her thigh. Marcus. Hey, you almost off? 40 minutes. Why do you sound like that? Like what? Like a man about to tell me something I already know. A pause on the line. Long enough that she knew. He doesn't want you there tonight, Marcus finally said. He called this morning. Said if you show up, he'll make it a scene in front of everybody. Simone leaned her head back against the shelf of saline bags and closed her eyes. She had met Walter Calloway exactly 4 times in 2 years of marriage. The first time he had looked through her like she was a smudge on a window. The second time, he told Marcus right in front of her that this would pass the way you'd talk about a rash. The third time, a courier had shown up at her apartment with a check for $40,000 and a typed note that said, for your discretion, please consider stepping back gracefully. She had never cashed it. She kept the note folded in the bottom of her jewelry box, the way some people kept a scar they didn't mind looking at once in a while, just so they'd remember what a thing looked like before it healed wrong. Marcus, she said, it's fine. I'll stay with Aya. No, his voice sharpened in a way she rarely heard from him. You're my wife, you have every right to be in that room. Your father doesn't see it that way. My father doesn't see a lot of things clearly. Never has. That's not going to be my problem tonight. She looked at the photo taped inside her locker. Aya, 9 years old, gap-toothed, braids with yellow beads, caught mid-law at a water park 2 summers back. Her neighbor Miss Ferris was already set up on the couch with a bowl of popcorn and full veto power over bedtime, which Aya had negotiated for herself with the seriousness of a union rep. I don't want to be the reason there's a scene at your father's gala, Marcus. You have never once caused a scene in your life, Simone. He causes them. That's the whole difference between you two, and it's why he can't stand you. I bought you a dress, he added, quieter. It's already on the bed. Please come with me tonight. I don't want to walk into that house alone. She thought, for a second, about the first time she'd ever seen Marcus Calloway 2 years back, in the exact hallway outside the room where Darius was sleeping now. He'd come in at 11 at night carrying his 6-year-old nephew, who'd swallowed a battery off the floor of a birthday party and wouldn't stop crying about it, more scared than hurt. Marcus hadn't known where to stand or what to do with his hands. He'd asked Simone 4 times if the boy was going to be fine, and the 4th time she'd looked up from the chart and said, "Sir, I've told you the same thing 3 times already, and it's still true the 4th time." And he'd laughed, surprised out of his own fear, and said something like, "I don't think anyone's ever talked to me like that before." That should have been her first warning that he came from a world where people were careful with him, for reasons that had nothing to do with kindness. He'd shown up at the nurse's station a week later with a box of pastries for the whole floor, and asked badly, clearly having rehearsed it in the parking lot, whether she'd ever consider getting coffee with a man whose nephew she'd basically saved. She'd said yes because he asked like a person and not like an invoice. She found the dress an hour later laid across their bed. Navy, simple, the kind of cut that didn't ask to be noticed and got noticed anyway. She stood in front of the mirror doing the clasp at the back of her neck, and her fingers found the thin gold chain that lived there most days, tucked under whatever she was wearing. On it hung her mother's wedding band, worn thin at the bottom from 30 years on a hand that delivered other people's babies for a living. Vivian Baptiste had died 2 years ago on a Tuesday morning of a stroke, sitting in her own kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold in front of her. She had been a labor and delivery nurse for 3 decades at a hospital, not 4 miles from where Simone worked now. She had raised Simone mostly alone, because Simone's father had spent the first 15 years of Simone's life stationed in places he wasn't allowed to name over the phone. When Simone mentioned her father at all, that he was simply gone, she let them assume it. It was easier than the truth, and the truth had a rule attached to it that her mother had given her the week before she died, sitting up in a hospital bed with an IV in her arm, and more clarity than the situation had any right to produce. "Don't you ever use his name to open a door for yourself, baby. Not one door, you hear me? You earn what's yours with your own 2 hands, same as I did, same as he did before either one of us had a name people recognized. You save his name for the day you have no other choice left in this world. That's the only day it's for." Simone had nodded and cried and promised, the way you promise a dying woman anything. She had kept that promise for 2 years. Tucking the chain under her collar, she had no idea how close she was to needing it. She did not know that Marcus, 3 hours earlier, sitting alone in the parking garage of his own office building, had made a phone call he had not told her about. She would not find out what was in that phone call until much later that night, in a foyer with marble floors, when it would matter more than almost anything else that happened. The Calloway estate sat on 4 acres in McLean, Virginia, behind a gate that opened for exactly the kind of people. Walter Calloway had spent 40 years learning to sort by the sound of their last name. Tonight it held 300 of them, senators, fund managers, 2 sitting judges, a retired cabinet secretary, who owed Walter a favor he intended to collect within the year. The Calloway Capital Holdings annual Founders Gala was Walter's masterpiece. The one night a year he got to stand in the center of a room and be looked at the way he believed he deserved to be looked at every day. Crystal chandeliers threw gold light across white peonies. A quartet worked through Vivaldi near the base of the staircase. Waiters in black vests moved through the crowd with champagne balanced on trays like they'd trained for it in a previous life, which some of them had. Walter worked the room the way he worked everything, with handshakes calibrated to the exact net worth of the hand he was shaking. Firm for his equals. Brief for everyone beneath his notice, which in Walter's private accounting was most of the room. His wife, Eleanor, moved beside him in cream silk, murmuring instructions to the event coordinator, without once raising her voice above the register of a woman discussing the weather. Everything was under control. Walter liked things under control the way some men like a particular brand of whiskey. It wasn't a preference. It was closer to a requirement of his nervous system. Then he looked toward the entrance. Marcus walked in first, and then Simone, his hand at the small of her back, the navy dress catching the chandelier light the way good tailoring does, on purpose. Walter's champagne glass stopped an inch from his mouth, his jaw set like a hinge closing. Eleanor's hand found his sleeve. Not here, Walter. He was already moving. 300 guests. And every single one of them watched Walter Calloway cross that floor, with the particular gait of a man who had decided 300 yards back exactly how this was going to go. What Walter did not know, what his own event coordinator hadn't thought to mention because the RSVP had come in through a side channel only 40 minutes earlier and hadn't yet made it onto the printed seating chart, was that the final confirmation for Table 1 that evening had come from a name that would have stopped Walter cold if he'd bothered to read past the surname, Baptiste. General M. Baptiste, RET Chairman, Ironclad Defense Systems. Walter did not read past the surname. Walter never read the guest list past the names he already recognized. That habit was about to cost him everything. The confrontation that opened this story happened exactly the way it happened, in real time, in front of every person who mattered to Walter Calloway's carefully constructed life. Marcus stepped half in front of Simone the second his father's path became clear, not to hide her, to plant himself. "Dad, before you say anything, I gave one instruction," Walter said, low enough to sound reasonable, and pitched to carry to the back wall anyway. "Do not bring her. And you walked her through my front door like you were daring me. She's my wife. She has no rights in this house." Walter's eyes moved over Simone slowly, the way a man inspects a return he intends to reject. "None in this family, none in this room. I'm not here to fight with you, Mr. Calloway," Simone said. Her voice came out even. She had learned in 8 years of delivering bad news to frightened parents exactly how to keep a voice level when the room wanted it to shake. "You're not here at all," Walter said. "That's the entire point." He tugged both cuffs into place, a habit Marcus had watched his whole life, the physical tell of a man resetting himself before he did something deliberate. This event is for people who've built something, people with a name worth protecting. And you walked in here in a dress somebody else bought you like you belonged among them. "She does belong," Marcus said, and his voice cracked in a way that surprised him. "She belongs in Petworth." Walter raised one finger. In a rented duplex, he raised a second. "Anywhere on the East Coast, except standing next to my son in front of people who matter." A woman near the quartet whispered something behind a gloved hand to the man beside her. "Well, she is well spoken," the man murmured back, like it was a compliment, like it wasn't the smallest and most familiar kind of insult Simone had heard in her entire adult life. Nobody near them laughed. Nobody stopped it either. That was the thing about rooms full of powerful people, Simone thought. They were experts at watching quietly. Walter reached into his jacket and produced a folded document. Cream paper, heavy stock, the kind of paper that costs extra specifically so it can announce its own importance. He set it on the nearest cocktail table beside a sweating champagne flute nobody had finished. "Since subtlety isn't landing," he said, "let's make this official. Family Protection and Succession Agreement," the cover read, 28 pages. "It says," Walter went on, tapping it once, "that you, Simone, or whatever you were called before you attached yourself to my son, waive every claim to Calloway family assets, every trust, every property, every share of this company that isn't already legally his." Marcus grabbed it, flipped pages with hands that had gone white at the knuckle. "Any child from a previous relationship," Walter said, watching his son's face, "receives nothing, not now, not ever. Regardless of what happens to my son." Something behind Simone's eyes went very still. "You're talking about my daughter," she said. "I'm talking about protecting 3 generations of what I built from someone who arrived with nothing and expects to leave with half of it." "There's a clause," Marcus said, voice shaking now, "that says Simone needs your written approval to attend any family event. Any of them. Funerals, Christmas." "From who?" Simone asked. "From me," Walter said. "And there's a second clause. If she's ever deemed in my sole judgment detrimental to the family's public reputation, the marriage is annulled with 0 compensation to her. 0. She walked away with what she came in with, which is nothing." "This isn't a legal document," Marcus said. "It's a leash. It's a choice," Walter said. "She signs tonight. She stays quiet. She keeps her seat at the back table and her mouth shut, and in exchange this family continues to exist without her fingerprints on it. Or she doesn't sign. He leaned in close enough that only Marcus caught the bourbon on his breath. And you lose the trust. $650 million gone by 9 a.m. I've already called the bank. One more call from me and every account with your name on it freezes overnight. Then, louder for the room. Let everyone hear it plainly, since apparently plain speaking is out of fashion. My son has chosen to marry a woman who cleans up after sick children for a living and brings this family nothing but a mortgage and somebody else's child. I want every person in this room to witness the judgment my son has shown tonight. The words landed the way a slap lands, quick and total. A senator suddenly found his phone fascinating. A waiter froze mid-step, the tray in his hands trembling just enough to click glass against glass. The quartet's bow came down off the strings and did not go back up. 300 people in tailored silk and wool, and not one of them said a word. Simone stood with her fingers pressed into her palms hard enough to leave marks, and she thought about her mother's kitchen and the promise she had made in a hospital room 2 years ago, and she thought, not yet, not for this. Mr. Calloway, she said, and her voice cut clean through the silence. I have a bachelor's in nursing from Howard University. I have spent 8 years keeping other people's children alive. I have never once asked your family for a single dollar. And I did not come into your home tonight to be humiliated in front of strangers. Walter smiled, slow. And yet here you are, he said, being humiliated. Funny how that works out. A ripple of laughter near the back, short, nervous. Ugly in the particular way that laughter gets when it knows exactly what it's agreeing to and does it anyway. Marcus tore the document in half. The sound of it cut through the room sharper than anything Walter had said all night. He dropped the pieces on the marble at his father's feet. We're done, he said. Excuse me, we're done, Marcus said again. I'm not signing, she's not signing, and I am done pretending you're something other than exactly what you just showed 300 people you are. Walter's face went from composed to something with no name for a moment, a vein rising at his temple. You're choosing her over everything I built for you. I'm choosing decency over you, Marcus said. That's not the same sentence you think it is. Walter turned to face the room one final time, and something in his posture recalibrated, settled into the shape of a man performing a verdict he'd already written. Then hear this clearly, he said. As of tonight you are no longer my son. Removed from the family trust, effective immediately. Terminated from Calloway Capital as of Monday morning. Vacate the Georgetown apartment by the end of the week. He looked at Simone, eyes gone flat as river stone. You wanted him, now you have him with nothing. That was the moment the ballroom doors should have opened and let them walk straight through. They didn't get that far. 2 men in dark suits materialized at the exit before Marcus and Simone had gone 10 steps. Arms folded, faces arranged into the particular blankness that private security cultivates on purpose. Nobody leaves yet, Walter said behind them, pleasant now, which was somehow worse than the shouting had been. I'm not finished with either of you, Marcus turned. Yeah, you are. Sit down, Marcus. Walter drew his phone out slowly, held it up like evidence. 1 call, that's all it takes. Your accounts, the ones you think are yours and aren't, frozen before you clear the driveway. He dialed. He didn't break eye contact with his son once because he wanted Marcus to watch him do it. Preston. Freeze every trust-linked account under Marcus Calloway's name, effective tonight. Confirmation in writing by morning. He ended the call, slid the phone away with 2 fingers like he was disposing of something. There, he said. Now you have nothing. No apartment, no card, no gas money for whatever you're driving back to Petworth in. He looked at Simone. Congratulations, he said. You married a penniless man. How does that feel from where you're standing? Marcus's fist closed at his side. Simone put a hand flat against his forearm, gentle, immovable. Don't, the pressure said. Not here. Not, let us leave, Walter, she said quietly. Walter ignored her entirely. He turned back to the room and raised his glass. A toast, he announced, to my former son and his lovely bride. May they enjoy a long and prosperous life together in Petworth. Nobody drank, nobody set their glass down either. 300 flutes hung suspended in the golden light, caught somewhere between cowardice and conscience, and stayed there. Near the bar, Preston Ainsley, Calloway Capital's general counsel, was reading something on his phone with the particular stillness of a man whose face has gone the color of old paper. He looked up, once toward the front doors, then back down at the screen, and said nothing at all. Lawyers, Simone would think much later, always know exactly when to start building distance from a sinking ship. A young woman near the edge of the crowd, 20-something, sharp-eyed, in a black dress that had clearly been chosen to be unremarkable in this particular room, caught Simone's gaze for half a second and mouthed 2 words, "I'm sorry," then looked away, because looking away was easier than being the one person in the room who did something else. Walter wasn't finished. Men like Walter Calloway didn't stop when they'd won. They stopped when there was nothing left standing to take another swing at. He crossed to the cocktail table, gathered the torn halves of the agreement, held them up for the room like an exhibit. 28 pages of protection for this family, he said, torn apart for a woman with a nursing certificate and somebody else's daughter. He let the pages fall and ground them under his heel against the marble. "That is what your marriage is worth to me tonight." Eleanor crossed the floor then, heels clicking in a silence thick enough to taste, and put a hand on her husband's arm, not to stop him, to stand beside him, to let the room see exactly where she'd chosen to stand. "Marcus, darling," Eleanor said, smooth as poured cream, "your father is doing this because he loves you. One day you'll understand that kind of love." Marcus looked at his mother, really looked, the way you look at someone once you've stopped needing their approval. "You stood there," he said quietly, the whole time, "and you didn't say one word. Family requires sacrifice, Marcus. Sometimes the sacrifice is yours to make quietly." "No, Mom," he turned away from both of them. "Sometimes the sacrifice is whatever's left of your own conscience. You made yours a long time ago." He took Simone's hand. The security men looked to Walter for instruction. Walter considered it a moment, the way a king considers a pardon he doesn't feel like signing, and then waved one hand. "Let them go," he said. 3 miles away, in a row house in Petworth with the porch light left on, Aya was losing a battle of wills with her own bedtime. Miss Ferris, 71, retired from 3 decades at the post office and permanently unimpressed by children who thought they could outlast her, sat on the couch with the remote in one hand and full veto power in the other. 10 more minutes, Aya said. "It's not even that late." "It is exactly that late," Miss Ferris said, "and your mama will know if I let you win this, and then she'll know I'm not to be trusted with the schedule, and then I don't get invited back, and then who's going to watch you eat cereal for dinner every time they're both working late?" Aya considered this with the seriousness of a much older negotiator. "Fine," she said, "but can I text Mom goodnight first? She's at a fancy party, baby. She might not see it right away." "Sees it," Aya said, already typing. She said she keeps her phone in her hand at parties like that because those parties make her nervous. She hit send on 3 words, "Night, Mommy, love," and put the phone face down on the coffee table and went up to brush her teeth without being asked twice, because in Aya's entire 9 years of life, her mother had never once failed to write back. The message sat on Simone's phone, unread, through the entire confrontation in the ballroom. She wouldn't see it until she was standing in the foyer with her father's arms around her, and when she finally did see it, she would have to step into the coat closet for a minute and put a hand over her mouth so nobody would hear what almost came out of her. They stepped through the heavy doors into the foyer, and the noise of the ballroom fell away behind them, like a held breath finally released. The foyer was cooler, quieter, lit by wall sconces and a 6-foot oil portrait of Walter Calloway that hung above the staircase like a monument he'd commissioned to himself. Simone leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. Her hands finally were shaking. "I'm sorry," Marcus said. His voice had gone raw. "I thought if they'd just met you." "They saw exactly who I am," Simone said. "That's the whole problem. They looked at me and saw precisely what they wanted to see. Nothing I said in there was ever going to change one mind." "He has nothing now," he said. "He actually did it." "You have me," she said, "and I have you, and we have Aya." "That's not nothing, Marcus. That's everything that actually counts." A long silence. Then Marcus said, quiet, almost afraid of the question, "Should I call your father?" Simone's fingers found the chain at her throat, her mother's ring warm against her collarbone. She had spent 2 years keeping her father's name in a drawer she didn't open for anyone, because she had wanted, needed, to know that every single thing in her life had been earned by her own hands and nobody else's. But tonight wasn't about pride anymore. Tonight a man had tried to erase her daughter from a family that daughter would never even want to belong to, and 300 people had watched it happen and called it entertainment. "I'll call him myself," she said, and pulled out her phone. One ring, two. Then a voice, deep, unhurried, the kind of voice that had given orders in places that no longer exist on unclassified maps. "Hey, baby girl, Dad." Her voice cracked on the single syllable, and 2 years of careful distance went with it. "I know," he said. "Marcus called me an hour ago." Simone went very still. "What?" "I'm already here, sweetheart. I've been sitting in your father-in-law's driveway for 6 minutes trying to decide whether to walk in there politely or walk in there like exactly what I am." Simone's phone lit up in her hand, 3 words from a 9-year-old who had no idea any of this was happening. "Night, Mommy, love." She stepped half into the coat closet off the foyer, pressed her free hand over her mouth, and let exactly 4 seconds of everything she was holding get out where nobody could see it. And she wiped her face, typed back "Night, baby, I love you more," and put the phone away. Through the heavy front doors, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of a car door closing, then footsteps on gravel, slow, even, entirely unhurried, the walk of a man who had entered rooms far more dangerous than this one and left every single one of them on his own terms. The doorbell rang, one long deliberate chime that rolled through the marble foyer like a verdict arriving early. And in the ballroom behind them, Walter Calloway was still smiling, still holding court, still warmed by the glow of his own cruelty. Too afraid to tell him, he had just made the worst mistake of his life. He had no idea who was standing on the other side of that door. He was about to find out. Simone opened it herself. Marcellus Baptiste stood on the front step in a charcoal suit that fit like it had been built around him rather than bought off a rack. Silver hair cropped close, a small enamel flag pin at his lapel, no jewelry, no flash, nothing extra. Just the particular kind of stillness that makes a room reorganize itself before he said a single word. He cupped his daughter's face in both hands. "You all right, baby girl?" She nodded, because if she opened her mouth right now, the whole night would come out of her at once, and she wasn't ready to let it yet. He turned to Marcus, took his hand, held the grip an extra beat. "You did right in there, son. I'm proud of you." Marcus's eyes went bright and he only managed a nod. Some things don't fit through words. The general straightened his jacket, adjusted the pin at his lapel, and looked toward the ballroom doors, where 300 muffled voices filtered through heavy wood. "Which one is he?" he asked. "You won't have to guess," Simone said. "Let's go make sure of that anyway," he said. And there was something almost gentle in the way he said it, the way a surgeon is gentle right before making the one cut that matters. He pushed both doors open at once. The sound cracked through the ballroom like something breaking. 300 heads turned. The quartet's bow came off the strings entirely this time and did not return. Marcellus Baptiste walked into that room the way he'd once walked into rooms with generals and cabinet secretaries in them. Unhurried, unbothered, communicating one single fact with every step. He was not here to ask anyone's permission for anything. Walter was near the bar, a fresh bourbon in hand, laughing at something a hedge fund manager had said that wasn't specially funny. He glanced toward the doors out of habit. The laugh died somewhere in his throat. He knew that face, not from a family photo, from the cover of a defense trade quarterly 2 years back. Ironclad secures record multi-year award. From 45 minutes he'd once spent waiting in a hallway at the Pentagon, just for the chance to shake this man's hand. From a framed photograph in his own general counsel's office of this exact man standing next to a sitting Secretary of Defense. Walter's color left his face in stages. First, the bourbon flush, then the confidence in his jaw, then his eyes went wide with the particular horror of a man doing math he doesn't want to be doing. Preston Ainsley by the bar closed his eyes briefly. He had known for 11 minutes. A calendar alert on his phone, quietly triggered an hour ago. Baptiste confirmed table 1. He hadn't warned Walter. Some instincts, once triggered, simply run the other way. The general crossed the floor. The crowd parted without needing to be asked, because every person in that room recognized the specific gravity of authority even when they couldn't have named its source. He stopped close enough that Walter had to tip his chin up to hold eye contact. "Walter," he said, and the single word carried to every corner of a room that had gone completely, perfectly silent. "We've met. Twice. Once at a Pentagon reception, where you waited 45 minutes for an introduction. Once, when your office called mine 3 times in a single week asking for a subcontract extension neither of us discussed tonight." Walter's mouth opened. Nothing came. The general went on, and he never once raised his voice, because he had learned decades ago that volume is what men reach for when they don't actually have the floor. "My daughter, the woman you called a nobody, the woman you tried to erase from her own marriage and strip her own child out of, is Simone Baptiste, my only child, a graduate of Howard University, a pediatric nurse who has kept more children breathing in the last 8 years than every person standing in this room combined has ever thought about, and the single most decent human being I have ever had the privilege of raising." He let that settle, the way a stone settles once it hits still water, and the rings keep spreading long after it's gone. "She never once used my name to open a door for herself," he said. "Not one door in her entire life. She wanted every single thing she has to be earned by her own 2 hands, and it is." He reached into his jacket, produced a single cream business card, and set it on the bar in front of Walter with 2 fingers, deliberate as a diagnosis. "Chairman, Ironclad Defense Systems," the card read. The same Ironclad Defense Systems that held a $2.6 billion multi-year subcontract with Meridian, Walter's largest portfolio holding. Same contract that made up 38% of every dollar Calloway Capital reported to its shareholders each quarter. Any board that lets one customer become more than 1/5 of its revenue is playing a game it doesn't understand, the general said almost conversationally, like he was explaining something to a first-year analyst rather than watching a man's face come apart in real time. "You built an empire on a number you never bothered to manage down. Tonight I'm the one who finally does the managing." Walter's knees went just slightly, enough that he had to grip the edge of the bar. The bourbon slid from his fingers and shattered against the marble, sharp and final, like a gavel coming down on something that couldn't be appealed. The room held its silence for 6 full seconds. In a room of 300 people, 6 seconds is a very long time. Then Walter moved, because standing still any longer meant accepting what had just happened in front of everyone he'd ever needed to impress. "General," he managed, his voice thinner than anyone in that room had ever heard it. "There's been a misunderstanding. I had no idea she was You had no idea she was somebody's daughter," the general said. "Or you assumed nobody who mattered would ever find out how you treat people you've already decided are beneath you. Which was it, Walter? The things I said, they were said in the heat of the moment. Family emotions run hot." "You had a 28-page legal document drafted this morning," the general said, quiet and devastating. "You had security post at your own exits before the first course was served. You froze your son's accounts with a single phone call live, in front of witnesses. That isn't heat, Walter. That's a plan you'd been sitting on for months." Walter stepped forward, one hand extended in a gesture meant to look collegial and landing instead as pure desperation. "Surely we can discuss this privately. There's no reason for a personal matter to touch a business relationship this important to both our companies." The general looked at the offered hand and did not take it. He let it hang in the air between them, unanswered long enough for the whole room to register the refusal. "You're right that it's important," he said. "Which is why it ends tonight unless you give me something in the next 60 seconds that convinces this room you aren't exactly the man you just showed them you are." Walter's eyes swept the ballroom, searching for one ally. He found 300 faces ranging from pity to open disgust, and not a single one of them moved toward him. Eleanor stepped in beside her husband, arranging her face into something diplomatic. "General, perhaps a meeting next week once. I watched you stand at that staircase and say nothing while your husband tried to erase my daughter's family in front of 300 witnesses, the general said, without even turning his head fully toward her. "Don't speak to me about cooler heads, ma'am. Yours was cool enough tonight already." Eleanor's diplomatic expression cracked like dried paint. The general took out his phone, dialed, and let the entire room hear every word. "Priya, Full audit of every Ironclad contract touching Meridian or any Calloway Capital subsidiary, every clause, every renewal option. I want it on my desk by Monday 9 a.m. He ended the call and looked back at Walter. 48 hours, he said. Resign as chairman. Issue a real public accounting of tonight, not whatever your communications team drafts at 3 in the morning to protect your name instead of admit the truth. Step personally away from every account that touches my company. If I don't see movement by Monday noon, my legal office handles the rest of it. A pause. And my legal office does not lose, Walter. Walter's legs folded under him and he sat, hard into the nearest banquet chair, head dropping into his hands, shoulders curling inward like a building giving way from somewhere deep inside its own foundation. For the first time in the entire evening, Walter Calloway had absolutely nothing left to say. Preston Ainsley was already moving, gathering his briefcase, repositioning himself near Marcus in the foyer, the particular geometry of a man recalculating exactly where power in a room had just relocated to. "We should talk Monday," Preston said quietly. "Just the two of us." Marcus nodded once. Renata Calloway Voss, Walter's younger sister, rose from her table near the corner where she'd sat through the entire evening, with her napkin twisted into a knot in her lap. She crossed to Simone with tears already running and took both her hands. "I'm sorry," Renata said, voice breaking. "I should have said something years ago. Tonight. Any of the times before tonight." Simone squeezed her hands. "Thank you for saying it now," she said, and meant it. Even though it had taken a small catastrophe to produce the first honest sentence anyone in that family had spoken to her all night. The general put an arm around his daughter. Marcus fell in on her other side. The three of them walked toward the front doors together while the ballroom stayed frozen behind them. Walter slumped in a chair sized for a smaller collapse than the one he was currently having. Eleanor standing alone with both hands wrapped around a champagne flute like it was the only solid thing left in the room, and 300 guests reached for their phones, not to help, to tell the story. The first text went out at 9:51 that night. Nobody ever confirmed who'd been recording from their phone. The whole time Walter stood at the center of the room with his finger raised, counting off insults like a man doing inventory. The audio was shaky, champagne glasses clinking somewhere in the background, but every word came through clean. By 2 in the morning it had 4 million views. By sunrise it was running on every major cable network in the country. Desmond Carter had been chasing corporate discrimination stories for the better part of a decade, mostly the kind that got a paragraph on page 11 and disappeared. The audio from the Calloway Gala landed in his inbox at 6:40 that morning from 3 different sources, and by 7 he had his editor on the phone. His piece ran online by 9. Calloway Capital chairman caught on audio in racist tirade. His son's wife is the daughter of a defense industry titan. Desmond hadn't just run the audio. He'd been quietly working sources inside Calloway Capital for 4 months on an unrelated tip, and the recording gave him the opening he needed to finally use what he'd collected. 5 former employees came forward within 48 hours, all of them black, all of them with stories that had been sitting in drawers for years, because nobody believed a complaint against Walter Calloway would ever go anywhere. One woman described being passed over for a directorship 3 separate times, despite the highest performance ratings in her department. Another produced internal emails in which Walter had referred to the firm's diversity hiring targets as, quote, optics for people who don't sign my checks. A young analyst named Imani Ross, who had been quietly building a case file of her own for over a year after being passed over twice for a promotion that went instead to 2 less qualified colleagues, sent Desmond 11 pages of documentation she'd been too afraid to use until now. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission opened a formal inquiry the following Monday. Under federal law, an employer doesn't need to use a slur to be liable for discrimination. A pattern of unequal treatment in hiring, pay, or promotion is enough on its own, and once the pattern is documented, the burden shifts hard against the company that built it. Preston Ainsley, reading the inquiry letter at his desk that morning, understood immediately just how much trouble Calloway Capital was actually in, and how little of it could be managed with a press release. Calloway Capital's stock opened Monday down 19%. By Wednesday's close it had lost 26%. Institutional investors began pulling out within the week, not because a conscience had suddenly developed inside a pension fund, but because a company this publicly toxic was simply bad math. Ironclad Defense Systems issued a 3-paragraph statement. Wednesday morning, each sentence built with the precision of a company that had excellent lawyers. Ironclad Defense Systems is conducting a full review of its contractual relationship with Meridian Systems and its parent, Calloway Capital Holdings. We do not sustain business partnerships with organizations whose leadership demonstrates conduct incompatible with our stated values. Findings will be announced upon completion of our review. 2 other major clients followed within 48 hours. Combined, the frozen or under review contracts totaled just over $3 billion. Calloway Capital's entire operating model had been built around the assumption that those relationships would never be questioned. Without them, the company wasn't shrinking. It was bleeding from every artery at once. Walter did not resign quietly or quickly. For a full day he sat in his study, calling board members one at a time, trying to negotiate, cajole, threaten his way back to some version of control. Every call went to voicemail. The silence on the other end of those lines, he would later admit to no one, was louder than anything anyone had said to his face at the Gala. Then, 4 days after the Gala, Brianna Clott, his longtime chief of staff, the woman who had run his calendar and his image for 11 years, and understood better than anyone exactly what he needed to survive, made one more move on his behalf, without waiting to be asked. She placed an anonymous call to Unity Children's Hospital's Human Resources Department. She claimed to be a concerned family member. She alleged that Simone Baptiste-Calloway had used privileged information from her employment to track down and harass a member of a prominent local family. She attached 2 photographs, carefully cropped, taken at a distance outside the hospital weeks earlier, time-stamped to suggest something they did not remotely show. Simone got the call at 6 the next morning. "Miss Calloway, this is Renee Ashford, head of HR at Unity. I'm sorry to reach you this early." Simone sat down slowly on the edge of her bed. "Miss Ashford, I'm calling to let you know that effective immediately you're being placed on administrative leave." Investigation. A complaint was filed yesterday, alleging misuse of patient-adjacent records and inappropriate contact with a family outside your professional duties. There are photographs attached to the complaint. Simone's voice came out steady, though her hands had started shaking again for the second time in 5 days. "Who filed it?" "I'm not able to share that during an active investigation." "Renee, who filed it?" A pause. The individual identified themselves as a concerned party close to a prominent local family and provided supporting documentation. "I have to ask you to stay home while we look into this, Miss Calloway. We've notified the state nursing board as a formality." The line went quiet for a second before Renee added, off the record, quieter, "Simone, I've known you 6 years. I don't believe one word of this complaint, but it's well put together. Whoever filed it knew exactly what they were doing. Get a lawyer. Take care of yourself." Simone sat with the phone in her hand for a long moment after the line went dead, and then she got up, showered, put on real clothes, and drove to the hospital anyway, not to work, since she wasn't allowed to, but to sit in the parking lot until her friend Denise, who ran the day shift on the same floor, came out on her break. Denise took one look at Simone's face through the windshield and got in the passenger seat without being asked. "They put you on leave," Denise said. "It wasn't a question. Somebody filed a complaint. Said I used hospital access to stalk a family. There's fake photos." Denise was quiet for a second, and then she said the thing that Simone would remember longer than almost anything else that whole week. "Baby, I've watched you hold dying children's hands for 6 years straight without ever once losing your composure in front of their mamas. If anybody upstairs actually reads your file instead of just reacting to a headline, this goes away by Friday." It didn't go away by Friday. It took 6 days. The investigation found the photographs had been selectively cropped and mislabeled. The complainant had no professional or medical standing to file the claim at all, and a records check showed Simone had never once accessed a chart outside her assigned patients. The complaint was withdrawn. The state board closed its file without action. Renee Ashford called Simone personally to apologize, and Simone thanked her and meant it. and went back to her shift the following Monday like nothing had happened at all because, to Simone in the ways that actually mattered, nothing had. When a local reporter called the nurse's station looking for comment on the whole affair, Simone gave him 7 words that ran as their own headline the next morning. "My patients need me. That hasn't changed." Brianna Locke was quietly let go from Calloway Capital 11 days later. Once the source of the anonymous tip traced back through a company email server, nobody had bothered to scrub properly. Walter did not defend her. He barely acknowledged the story when it broke. By then he had considerably larger fires to manage, and had, in the particular way of men like him, already stopped thinking about the people he used up on his way through a room. Walter resigned as chairman of Calloway Capital Holdings on the 9th day. In a recorded statement filmed in his own study, navy suit, small flag pin at the lapel, the detail that did not go unnoticed given whose lapel it had first appeared on 3 nights earlier. "I deeply regret the remarks I made." He read from a teleprompter with all the conviction of a man reading someone else's obituary. "My words do not reflect the values of this company or this family. I take full responsibility and am committed to growth." The internet responded the way the internet responds to an apology that arrived only after the stock price did. He got caught. "Growth, sir, you are 63 years old." A widely shared image of Walter's face pasted onto a slowly collapsing building circulated for the better part of a month. The class action followed 2 weeks later. 6 former Calloway Capital employees, all black, alleging a pattern of discrimination in hiring, promotion and pay that a forensic audit would eventually trace back more than a decade. Damages sought, $62 million. The case settled 10 months later for $58 million. One of the largest private sector discrimination settlements of the year, and included a 5-year consent decree requiring independent oversight of hiring and promotion at every level of the company. Eleanor filed for divorce 4 months after the gala. In a deposition that later became part of the public record, opposing counsel asked her plainly why she had never once in 31 years said a word. "Because saying something never once changed anything he did," Eleanor said. "It only ever changed how he treated me for saying it. So I stopped, a long time before you were born, counselor. And I got very good at telling myself that silence and peace were the same thing. They are not the same thing. I understand that now, mostly because a 9-year-old girl I've never met got to keep her whole family, and I lost mine trying to protect a man who never once protected me back." She stated under oath that Walter had used the language he used at that gala privately, and often for the entire length of their marriage, and that her own silence over the years had been born of financial dependence rather than agreement. The court awarded her $165 million. She relocated to Naples, Florida, changed her professional name back to her maiden one, and declined every time she was asked to discuss any of it publicly ever again. Walter's net worth fell from just over $2 billion to roughly $900 million within the year. Once the stock losses, the settlement, and the legal fees finished doing their arithmetic, he sold the McLean estate and moved into a smaller house 40 minutes further out, where nobody called to ask his opinion about anything, and where, according to court records tied to a separate consent agreement with the EEOC, he completed a 12-session workplace equity training program in full, sitting in the back row of a community college classroom each time, saying nothing, finishing every session in complete silence. Marcus was named interim CEO of Calloway Capital by unanimous board vote within the month, on the condition of a full independent audit of hiring practices, a rewritten promotion structure, and the reinstatement of every one of the employees whose promotions had been quietly buried under his father's tenure. He accepted with one condition of his own, that Simone would have no formal role in any of it, no title, no seat, nothing that could ever let anyone say she'd married her way into influence. He wanted the company to be rebuilt on the same terms she'd built her own life on, earned, one decision at a time, with nobody handed anything they hadn't already proven they deserved. Imani Ross was promoted to vice president within her first year under the new leadership. The same title she'd been passed over for twice under Walter, once in favor of a man who'd been at the firm 18 months, once in favor of a man who'd been at the firm 11. The announcement went out company-wide. She printed it, folded it once, and put it in the same drawer where she'd kept 11 pages of documentation she'd been too afraid to use for over a year. She told a colleague later that the folder didn't feel like proof of what had been done to her anymore. It felt like proof of what had finally been done right. When a business journal asked Marcus what had actually changed at the company, he gave an answer that ran as its own headline. "The leadership," he said. "Everything else was already there. We just finally let it work." Simone went back to Unity the Monday after the investigation cleared her, clocked in at 6, and spent the morning holding a 4-year-old's hand through a nebulizer treatment while his mother cried quietly with relief in the corner of the room. Nothing about that part of her life had changed because it had never needed changing in the first place. She was promoted to charge nurse of the pediatric unit. 8 months later, a promotion her supervisor called, in front of the whole floor, about 2 years overdue. She and Marcus stayed in the Petworth row house rather than moving anywhere larger, because Aya had finally stopped asking when they'd have to move again, and neither of them was willing to be the reason she started asking that question one more time. Marcus formally adopted Aya the spring after the gala, in a small courtroom with exactly 6 people in the gallery. When the judge asked Aya, as a formality, whether she understood what today meant, she thought about it with the seriousness of someone reading fine print and said, "It means he's not allowed to leave now, right?" And the judge, who had presided over 100 of these hearings and rarely laughed during one, laughed. "That's right," the judge said. "He's not allowed to leave now." "Good," Aya said, "because he already promised." The general retired from Ironclad the following spring, though retired, for a man built the way Marcellus Baptiste was built, mostly meant he stopped taking a salary. Ironclad reinstated its contract with Meridian under Marcus's leadership 18 months later, with new terms requiring an annual third-party equity audit as a condition of renewal. The general picks Aya up from school most Wednesdays now. They get ice cream at the same shop every time, the same 2 flavors, no negotiation required. He tells her stories about her grandmother Vivian, about the babies she caught in her own 2 hands for 30 years, about the particular kind of stubborn it takes to do a hard job quietly for 3 decades and never once ask anyone to notice. He makes sure she knows exactly where she comes from, on both sides of her family. In full, Renata is the only member of the Calloway side who still comes around. She visits monthly without fail and always brings something small for Aya. Usually a book, always inscribed on the inside cover in careful handwriting. It's the most honest apology she knows how to give, and after enough months of it, Simone stopped needing her to give a bigger one. Walter has not spoken to Marcus in over a year. The last anyone in the family heard of him, he was still attending the same community college on the 2nd Tuesday of every month for a continuing compliance course that had been added to his consent agreement almost as an afterthought. Sitting in the same back row, wearing the same visitor badge clipped crooked to his shirt, learning, at 64, lessons about basic human dignity that most people manage to absorb by the time they're 5 years old. On a Saturday in late spring, more than a year after the night of the gala, Simone sat on the front steps of the Petworth row house with a mug of coffee going lukewarm in her hands. Marcus sat beside her. Aya's laugh carried out from the backyard where she was teaching the dog next door, a trick that clearly wasn't working yet. They didn't talk for a while. They'd been together long enough that not talking had become its own kind of conversation. "I keep thinking about that night," Marcus said eventually. "Which part?" "The doorbell," he said. "I called your father that morning and didn't tell you, and I've never really explained why. I think I was scared you'd tell me not to." Simone considered that. "Would I have?" "Probably," he admitted, "and I would have listened, and then I would have watched you get torn apart in that room with nobody standing behind either one of us." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "You did the right thing scared," she said. "That still counts as brave. Maybe more than the kind that isn't scared at all." A bus rolled by 2 streets over. Somewhere down the block a kid yelled something victorious about a bike ramp. The afternoon smelled like cut grass and somebody's charcoal grill 3 houses down. Aya came around the side of the house with grass stains on both knees, and the dog next door still trailing her hopefully, and dropped down onto the step below them, leaning back against her mother's shins like she'd done since she was small enough to fit there properly. "Grandpa's coming Wednesday, right?" she said. Not a question, really, more a fact she was confirming out loud. "Wednesday," Simone said, and threaded her fingers absently through her daughter's braids the way she'd done every day for 9 years, the way her own mother had done for her. Aya tipped her head back to look up at both of them upside down, squinting against the sun. "Can we get the ice cream place to give him extra sprinkles this time? He never gets sprinkles and I think it's sad." "I will absolutely bring that up with the general," Marcus said, entirely serious, and Aya nodded like justice had finally been served on a matter she'd been tracking for some time. Simone thought about her mother's kitchen and the promise she'd made in a hospital room with an IV line taped to the back of one thin hand. She thought about the exact moment she'd finally used her father's name, not to open a door for herself, but to stand in one that had already been slammed shut in her daughter's face. Her mother had been right, in the end, the way her mother was right about most things. There was exactly one day that name was for. Simone had known it the moment it arrived, and she hadn't wasted it on anything smaller than what it was actually worth. She was, these days, paying close attention to which days those were. "Okay? Before you scroll away, let me talk to you for a second, one person to another. This story is fiction. Simone isn't real. Marcus isn't real. Walter and Eleanor and the General aren't real. Calloway Capital and Ironclad Defense Systems don't exist. If they did, I imagine their lawyers would already be on the phone with each other. A few things in this story are real, though, and I put them in on purpose. Workplace discrimination based on race is still very much a live legal and human problem in this country, and it doesn't always look like a slur shouted across a ballroom. More often it looks exactly like what happened quietly to Imani in this story. The same qualifications passed over 3 times and nobody ever writing the real reason down anywhere you could point to. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission exists specifically to investigate patterns like that. And if you think you're living through one right now, their public comment process doesn't cost you anything to start. You don't need a lawyer standing next to you on day one. You just need to start writing things down. Revenue concentration, the idea that a company can become dangerously dependent on one client or one contract, is a real and boring and extremely important business concept. And I put it in this story on purpose too, because I think people should understand a little more about how fragile even billion-dollar companies can be when they build their whole house on one client's goodwill. Retaliation against someone for standing their ground, the way Brianna moved against Simone's job in this story, is also real, and it's also illegal in most circumstances, and it's one of the ugliest and most common tools used against people who've already done nothing wrong except refuse to disappear quietly. If that's happened to you or is happening to you right now, please know that retaliation claims are often easier to prove than the original discrimination, because there's usually a timeline, and timelines don't lie even when people do. One more thing before I let you go. This story has a wedding-adjacent ending. It has a villain who loses everything in a room full of witnesses. It has justice arriving fast and clean and complete, and I know real life is almost never that tidy. I wrote it this way anyway, because sometimes you need to watch the person who was cruel lose something real in front of the people whose opinion they valued most, even if it's only on a screen, even if it only happens exactly once in a story I made up on a Tuesday. Stories don't fix anything by themselves. They just remind you which endings are still possible and worth working toward. If any part of this hit close to home, tell me in the comments. Tell me about your own mother's kitchen table wisdom. Tell me about the promise you're still keeping, or the one you finally used. Take care of each other out there. The world asks people to shrink more often than it should. You don't have to let it.